After losing her husband to a sudden illness, Martha believed the silence of her farmhouse would swallow her whole. Days passed without a laugh, without a voice, until a golden retriever named Apollo came into her life. He was retired too in his own quiet way, carrying old stories in his eyes and warmth in his paws. One unexpected afternoon, Apollo led her into a field and toward something she never expected to feel again: joy. Because sometimes the smallest moments heal the biggest wounds. Chapter 1. The Silence of the House. The house had never been this quiet, not even in winter when the snow muffled the world and the fire crackled softly in the hearth. Not even in the early mornings when her husband used to leave before sunrise to feed the animals, whistling as he pulled on his boots. Now the silence was not just quiet, it was hollow. Martha sat in her usual spot near the kitchen window, cradling a warm cup of chamomile tea in both hands. The steam curled up to her face, but the scent barely registered anymore. It was a morning like every other since James passed. A calendar full of empty squares, a house full of echoing rooms, and a heart heavy with memories. Outside, the wind nudged the dry leaves along the porch. A lone wind chime clinked gently, sounding almost shy. James had built this house with his own hands. Every beam, every floorboard, every fence post. He'd even carved their initials into the side of the porch when they were just 22 and stupid in love. Now she was 67 and surrounded by the life they'd built, yet somehow completely alone in it. The worst part was the routine. Every morning, Martha still reached for 2 mugs out of habit. She still poured 2 cups of tea. She still turned to speak before realizing no one was there to listen. She tried the TV. It felt loud and meaningless. She tried music. It made her cry. Her daughter, Emily, called every Sunday and always said the same thing at the end. "Mom, maybe it's time to get out of the house. Or at least, maybe get a pet, just for company." Martha would smile and nod as if that would magically fix everything. But grief didn't need company. It needed time. And sometimes it just needed space to breathe. Still, the loneliness had begun to settle in deeper lately. It curled around her ankles when she stood at the sink. It sat across from her at the empty table. It whispered in her ear at night when the wind howled too hard. One morning in late autumn, Martha stood on her porch with a blanket around her shoulders and stared at the empty dirt road. And for the first time, she whispered aloud, "I can't do this alone anymore." She didn't know who she was talking to. God, James, maybe just herself. But the moment the words left her lips, the silence broke just slightly, and she took that as a sign. That afternoon, she called the local rescue center. Chapter 2. Meeting Apollo. The rescue center wasn't far, just a 15-minute drive through winding country roads dotted with hay bales and fading sunflowers. Martha hadn't driven that route in months. The tires crunched over gravel as she pulled into the gravel lot, her heart drumming louder than the engine. She had told herself this was just a visit, just a look, no commitments. But deep down, a quiet hope stirred like a forgotten song humming back to life. The woman who greeted her wore a green fleece and a gentle smile. "You must be Martha. I'm Joy." Her name matched her voice, calm, software steady. They walked through a line of kennels where curious eyes peeked through metal bars and tails wagged like metronomes of possibility. Joy explained each dog's story, some abandoned, some surrendered, some rescued from hard lives. Martha nodded politely, but none of the dogs made her feel anything more than a polite ache. until they reached the end of the row. There, lying quietly on an old patchwork blanket, was a golden retriever with a silvery muzzle and deep, wise eyes. His fur was rough in places, his ears a little worn at the edges, but there was a kind of softness in his stillness. He didn't bark. He didn't jump. He just looked at her like he knew something. "That's Apollo," Joyce said, lowering her voice. "He's a retired rescue dog. Worked in disaster zones years ago. Floods, fires. But he's older now, slower. Some people pass him by because of that." Martha knelt down, a quiet creak in her knees. Apollo lifted his head and blinked slowly as if recognizing her from a dream. Then he did something that surprised her. He scooted forward inch by inch and gently placed his paw on the metal gate between them. Martha's breath caught in her throat. "He doesn't do that for everyone," Joy whispered. For a long moment, Martha and Apollo just looked at each other. She saw a soul that had been through something. She didn't know what, but it mirrored her own pain in a way that words couldn't. "May I sit with him?" she asked. Joy opened the gate without hesitation. Inside the kennel, Martha sat cross-legged on the floor. Apollo padded toward her, slow and deliberate, and then, without fanfare, rested his head on her lap, as if he'd been waiting for her, as if he'd found her. Martha placed a hand on his back. His fur was warm, coarse at the tips, but soft underneath. A tear slipped down her cheek, unexpected and unannounced. She didn't brush it away. By evening, Apollo was curled up in the passenger seat of Martha's pickup truck, his head resting against the window, watching the trees blur past. She glanced over at him as they neared the old farmhouse. "I guess it's not just my house anymore," she said. Apollo didn't answer, of course, but he gave one soft sigh, and somehow the silence didn't feel quite so empty anymore. Chapter 3. A Companion in the Quiet. Martha had almost forgotten what it felt like to open her front door and not walk into silence. Apollo padded in gently, pausing at the threshold like he was asking for permission. She smiled softly and stepped aside, whispering, "Come on in, sweetheart. This is home now." He sniffed the air, curious but calm, his tail wagging slowly, not in excitement, but in quiet approval. Martha watched as he explored the kitchen first, then the living room. When he passed the rocking chair by the fireplace, he paused and gave it a sniff. James used to sit there every night after supper. It made her chest ache to see Apollo nose it, like he sensed something had once lived there. That night, after dinner, which Apollo ate politely, tail thumping only once, Martha sat in that old rocking chair with her knitting. She hadn't touched the yarn in over a year. Her fingers felt clumsy, unfamiliar with the rhythm. Apollo lay beside her, head resting on his paws, his eyes half closed in the flicker of the firelight. "You're not much for noise, are you?" she murmured. Apollo didn't lift his head, but his tail gave a soft thump. The quiet between them wasn't empty anymore. It was shared. The days passed like autumn leaves falling, gently, softly, one by one. Martha found herself falling into a new routine, not one she had chosen, but one that chose her. She woke to Apollo's soft paws pacing near her bedroom door. He never barked to wake her, just waited. When she opened the door, he'd wag once and trot toward the kitchen like he'd been dreaming of breakfast. She began to walk again, short strolls down the gravel path by the barn, Apollo at her side. She spoke to him more than she expected, telling him about James, about the days when this farm was full of animals, full of purpose. Apollo never interrupted. He only listened. And somehow, the act of speaking, out loud, to someone who didn't expect her to be anything but herself, brought her peace. One day, while dusting the shelf in James' old study, Martha found a photograph tucked behind a stack of books. It was of James in the pasture, laughing, holding out a hand to feed a cow. Behind him, a much younger Martha was standing barefoot in the grass, grinning at the sky. She hadn't seen that photo in years. Her fingers trembled. She took it into the living room, sat on the floor beside Apollo, and placed the picture on the rug. He scooted closer and sniffed the paper gently. Then he rested his head on her lap and looked up at her. "You'd have loved him," she whispered. "He had a good heart." Apollo's eyes didn't blink, just watched her with the same soft understanding he always seemed to carry. That was the thing about dogs like him. Rescue dogs. They had known fear, pain, survival. They could see what others missed. He was retired now, yes, but something in him was still working, still tuned to healing, and Martha was beginning to feel it. Later that evening, she sat on the porch while Apollo lay beside her, nose tilted into the wind. The sky turned the soft blue of dusk, and the crickets began their nightly chorus. Fireflies blinked near the edge of the fields. Martha looked down at her companion. "I didn't think I had room left in my heart," she said. "But you're making space." Apollo didn't wag his tail. He didn't move, but he sighed deeply and rested his head on her foot. And in that quiet, ordinary moment, Martha realized something extraordinary. She wasn't alone anymore. Chapter 4. The Farm Visit. It had been over a year since Martha had gone beyond the borders of her property. Her world had shrunk quietly, like a sweater put through the wrong wash cycle. At first, it was grief, then fatigue, then habit. Days spent in a tight circle: kitchen, living room, bedroom, porch, rinse, repeat. But something about Apollo made her start to look outward again. It began with walks along the gravel lane, then farther, up the hill behind the barn where James used to stack hay bales. Apollo would lead, pausing every few steps to glance back, as if saying, "Come on, you're doing fine." One Tuesday morning, with the sun barely warming the earth, Martha stood at her front door, keys in hand, and looked down at Apollo. "How about a little adventure today?" Apollo, lying by the screen door, perked up at the sound of her voice. His ears twitched, tail gave a lazy wag. "There's a farm down the road," she said, more to herself than to him. "The Evertons still run it. James and I used to go there this time of year. See the calves, buy fresh honey. Maybe they're still open." Apollo stood, stretched long and slow, then walked to the truck and sat beside the door like it was the most natural thing in the world. Martha chuckled. "Well, that's settled then." The drive was quiet, except for the hum of old country songs on the radio. Martha kept sneaking glances at Apollo, who watched the passing fields with calm curiosity. His breath fogged the passenger window just slightly. He looked peaceful. And she realized she did too. The Everton farm hadn't changed much. Same split-rail fences, same red barn leaning just a little to the left. As she pulled in, a hand-painted sign read, "Fresh milk and fall honey. Visitors welcome." A young woman in overalls stepped out of the barn, brushing hay off her palms. "Martha, is that you?" she called, squinting into the sun. Martha blinked. "Katie?" Katie Everton, now nearly 30, had been a teenager the last time Martha saw her. Her freckles were the same, but her smile had grown into the confident kind that comes from working the land. "It's so good to see you," Katie said, walking up to the truck. Then her eyes dropped to the passenger side. "And who's this gentleman?" Martha smiled. "This is Apollo. He's family now." They walked the pasture slowly, Katie chatting beside her, Apollo trotting just ahead, The crisp breeze rustled the grasses, and the scent of hay and damp earth filled the air. Martha breathed it in like medicine. And then it happened. As they rounded a fence line near the back pasture, a small herd of cows came into view, lazily grazing, their ears flicking at the sound of footsteps. Apollo stopped. His body stiffened, not in fear, but in sudden alertness. Then, with a burst of joy that caught Martha completely off guard, he leapt forward toward the fence, ears perked, tail wagging furiously, a half bark, half whine escaping his throat. The cows turned, startled at first. But then, something magical happened. One by one, they began to wander toward him, curious, calm. Apollo pranced along the fence line like a puppy, stopping every few feet to bark softly, almost conversationally. One cow, a soft brown one with big eyes, stepped closest, and the two stood nose to nose, only the wood rail between them. Martha stood frozen. She had never seen Apollo like this, not since he'd arrived. So much life, so much happiness. His entire body radiated joy, like he was remembering something, or returning to something he'd loved long ago. And that's when the tears came. She didn't even try to stop them. She pressed a hand to her chest as the emotion surged, a flood of grief and joy and something like relief, all tangled together. Katie placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You okay?" Martha nodded, eyes still on Apollo. "He hasn't smiled like that before," she said softly. And then, almost to herself, "Neither have I." They sat on a hay bale later, sipping sweet tea as the sun dipped low. Apollo lay nearby, tongue lolling, eyes content. "You're welcome to come back anytime," Katie said. "He seems to love it here." Martha nodded, her voice quiet. "He does. And maybe I do too." Chapter 5. The Cows in the Field. The next morning, Martha woke with a kind of ache she hadn't felt in years. Not grief, not sorrow, but something different. Longing. She missed the pasture, the breeze, the feel of the sun on her shoulders, and the sound of Apollo's paws dancing over the dry grass. Most of all, she missed the look in his eyes when he saw the cows. Pure, uninhibited joy. Like something in him had come back to life. She hadn't known how much she needed that moment too. Later that afternoon, she picked up her keys again. "Well, what do you say, boy?" she asked. Apollo stood immediately, ears perked, tail thumping once, twice, 3 times. No hesitation. Back at the Everton farm, the fields were quiet under a hazy gold sky. Katie wasn't around, but Martha had already been told she was welcome any time. She parked by the fence line, rolled down the windows, and opened the passenger door. Apollo jumped out more quickly than she expected for a dog his age. He trotted ahead, already knowing where he wanted to go. Martha followed slowly, letting the silence wrap around her. Not like a blanket this time, but like a familiar old song. She could see Apollo ahead, trotting toward the same group of cows grazing near the fence. This time, the cows recognized him. The soft brown one, the same one from the day before, was the first to look up. Her ears flicked, and she started walking toward the dog with slow, steady steps. The others followed behind her like shadows. Apollo stopped just before the fence, sitting back on his haunches. Then, like yesterday, he barked, not sharply, but in a kind of rhythm, friendly, cheerful, communicative. Martha sat down a few feet behind him on a grassy patch. She didn't want to interfere. She just wanted to watch, and what she saw took her breath away. Apollo wagged his tail and looked from one cow to another, his entire body language relaxed, open. One of the cows bent her head, touching her large nose against the post, just inches from him. Apollo leaned forward slightly, almost brushing noses. It was so simple, So quiet, and yet so profound. Tears stung Martha's eyes again, but this time she welcomed them. They came not from the jagged edge of grief, but from something softer, a thawing, a recognition. This was joy, gentle, unforced, and completely unexpected. She didn't realize how tightly she'd been holding on to the sadness, like it was a duty, a tether to James, as if letting go meant forgetting him. But Apollo had never met James, and still, here he was, teaching her how to live again. She spoke softly, the way people talk in sacred places. "Do you remember cows from your old work, boy?" she whispered. "Or did you just love them all along?" Apollo turned his head slightly at the sound of her voice, then trotted back to her, tail still wagging. He sat beside her and leaned gently against her shoulder. Martha closed her eyes. For a long time, neither of them moved. The cows wandered away slowly, their curiosity satisfied, their presence lingering like the scent of fresh grass. Later, driving home, Martha rested one hand lightly on Apollo's head as he dozed beside her. The windows were down, and the air smelled like October. She thought of James, not with the painful jab she'd grown used to, but with a quiet warmth, a memory that didn't tear, but simply rested beside her. She smiled. It had been so long since she smiled like that and meant it. Chapter 6. A Healing Moment. It was just after sunset when they returned home. The farmhouse glowed with the soft amber light of the porch lantern. Crickets had begun their nightly serenade. As Martha stepped out of the truck, Apollo leapt down beside her with an energy that surprised her. He stood still for a moment, nose lifted to the breeze, then looked back at her, tail gently swaying. Martha closed the truck door quietly. She stood there for a long while, hand resting on the hood, eyes turned toward the field behind her house where shadows stretched like long memories across the land. She couldn't explain it, not fully, but something in her had changed. And it started, she realized, not in a grand epiphany, but in a moment. One simple, unexpected moment in a cow pasture, watching her golden retriever act like a joyful child. Later, with the kettle warming in the kitchen, she found herself humming, just softly, an old tune James used to sing while fixing things around the house. She hadn't thought of it in years. She paused, startled by her own voice, and then she smiled. Apollo watched her from his spot on the rug, his head tilted slightly. His eyes carried that same weightless, wordless empathy that had settled her from the first day. "You know," she said, pouring water into her teacup, "I thought I'd live the rest of my life with only half a heart." She sat down in the armchair beside the window. Apollo rose and crossed the room to lie beside her, resting his chin on the top of her slipper. But maybe healing doesn't happen all at once. She ran her fingers gently through his fur, watching the steam swirl above her cup. "Maybe it happens in a cow field of all places," she added with a soft laugh. "With a dog like you teaching an old woman how to laugh again." Apollo sighed, long and low, the kind of sound that says, "I understand better than any words could." That night, Martha didn't cry before bed. She didn't clutch her husband's pillow like a lifeline. She didn't stare at the ceiling searching for meaning in the cracks. She simply lay there, Apollo curled at the foot of the bed, his body rising and falling with each slow breath. And she felt something she hadn't in a very long time. Safe. Not because the grief was gone, it never would be entirely, but because she wasn't carrying it alone anymore. The next morning, she stood barefoot on the porch, tea in hand, watching the sun rise over the field. Apollo sat beside her, alert and quiet. Birds trilled in the distance. Martha turned to him and said without hesitation, "We should go back tomorrow. I think the cows will miss you." Apollo wagged his tail once, and Martha let the joy rise, not in a rush, not like a wave, but like the steady warmth of morning light, spilling slowly across everything that once felt cold. Chapter 7. Sharing the Joy. The third time Martha visited the Everton farm, she brought cookies. "Your famous molasses ones?" Katie grinned, holding up the tin with reverence. Martha chuckled. "The very same. I figured if your cows are going to keep entertaining my dog, it's only fair I offer a peace offering." They both laughed, the easy kind of laughter that comes not from jokes, but from connection. Apollo had already trotted toward the pasture, where the now familiar brown cow waited near the fence. It had become a silent routine. He'd greet the herd with soft barks. They'd gather like an audience, and the two species would talk in a language older than words. Katie leaned against the fence beside Martha. "He really does love them," she said. Martha nodded, eyes shining. "He's different when he's here. Lighter, like he's remembering who he used to be." "Like you," Katie said gently. Martha looked at her, surprised, then smiled. "Yeah, like me." It wasn't long before the small-town grapevine did its thing. First, it was a neighbor who spotted her walking Apollo along the roadside and stopped to chat. Then it was a woman from church, one Martha hadn't seen in months, who waved from across the grocery store and asked about the dog who plays with cows. People were curious, but more than that, they were moved. One afternoon, the mail carrier, a young man named Travis, handed Martha her letters and hesitated. "I hope this isn't weird," he said, "but my mom, she lost my dad last year, and she's been struggling. I told her about you and your dog, about the cows. She said it sounded like a Hallmark movie, and then asked me to find out where this magical farm was." Martha's laughter bubbled up, warm and full. "Tell her she's welcome anytime," she said. And just like that, a trickle became a stream. A few days later, Martha returned to the pasture with Apollo and found another woman standing by the fence. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her posture guarded. Apollo walked right up to her. He sat at her feet, looked up, and gently placed his paw on her shoe. The woman let out a sound that was half a laugh, half a sob. And just like that, something softened. Word spread. Soon the Everton farm saw more visitors, mostly older women, many with dogs of their own. Some had lost spouses, others grown children. A few just carried the quiet ache of being forgotten. Martha started organizing what she jokingly called the Cow Club. Saturday mornings, bring your dog, walk the fence, talk if you want, be silent if you don't. It wasn't official. No Facebook page, no sign-up sheet. Just a time, a place, a promise of gentle company. And Apollo? He became a kind of ambassador. The other dogs followed his lead. Calm, curious, unafraid of the cows. His patience seemed to rub off on them, and his quiet presence became a comfort to humans and animals alike. Martha often stood beside the others, hand tucked in her coat pocket, watching her dog forge connections that words never could. One morning, as they all walked back to the cars, a woman named Helen touched Martha's arm. "I haven't smiled like that in months," she said. Martha took her hand, squeezed it lightly. "I hadn't either," she replied, "but Apollo reminded me how." That night, Martha wrote in her old journal for the first time since James died. The words came slowly, but they came. "Today I saw joy multiply, not mine alone, but shared. Apollo didn't just help me heal. he made space for others to begin too. And isn't that what healing really is? Not a finish line, but a hand reaching backward to help the next soul along. She closed the book gently. In the quiet, Apollo lifted his head from the foot of her bed, looked at her sleepily, and sighed. "I think you were always meant to be more than just my dog," she whispered. And Apollo, as always, didn't need to answer. Chapter 8. New Friendships. By mid-November, Saturday mornings at the Everton farm had become something of a ritual. There were no flyers, no website, no formal invitation. And yet, every week, more people came. Some brought dogs, some didn't. Some just came to sit on folding chairs near the fence and breathe in the quiet. There were flannel blankets, warm thermoses of cider, and the occasional tin of baked goods passed down the line. But the constant, always, was Apollo. He moved through the group like a thread of gold, weaving people together with nothing more than his calm presence. He would sit beside someone new, lean gently into their side, and somehow they'd begin to talk. Not always about their pain. Sometimes just about the weather, or a pie recipe, or memories of their own dogs long gone. He made it easy. Martha watched it all with wonder. How had a dog, rescued, retired, slightly gray at the muzzle, become the heart of something like this? One chilly morning, a man named Harold showed up with a black lab named Lucy. He was tall, quiet, wearing a cap pulled low, and the kind of sadness that hung around his shoulders like a heavy coat. He didn't talk much at first, just stood at the edge of the group, hands in pockets, watching. Martha made her way over slowly. "You're welcome to walk with us," she said gently. He nodded once, didn't speak. Apollo walked up, sniffed Lucy, then turned and walked a few steps down the path, pausing, looking back, tail wagging. Harold hesitated, then followed. No one needed to say anything. Over time, Martha noticed a change in herself too. She laughed more, hugged people without overthinking it, took photos with new friends, and shared stories about James without choking up. And it wasn't just her. Helen, the woman who used to cry every time she saw Apollo, now baked muffins and carried them in a basket with a gingham towel. Rosa, who had been painfully shy, started offering rides to others who didn't drive anymore. Even Katie, busy as she was with farm chores, began joining the group each Saturday, her toddler bouncing on her hip, smiling at the dogs through her baby teeth. It was like watching flowers bloom in late fall, unexpected, tender, and all the more beautiful for it. One day, after the walk, Harold stood beside Martha at the fence line. "My wife passed 2 years ago," he said suddenly, his voice low. "I used to talk to the cows too. Thought I was going crazy." Martha smiled softly. "Then you'd fit right in with the rest of us." He nodded. "Thanks for this, all of it." Martha looked toward Apollo, now lying in the grass with Lucy tucked against him. "Don't thank me," she said. "Thank the one who started it all." That evening, Martha stood in her living room, brushing burrs from Apollo's fur. "You know," she said, brushing gently behind his ears, "you didn't just bring me back to life, you brought others too." Apollo looked up at her with those soft amber eyes. "You're more than just a good boy," she whispered. "You're a bridge." She kissed the top of his head. Apollo sighed deeply and pressed his face into her palm. Outside, the wind rustled through bare trees. Inside, warmth radiated from something deeper than the fireplace, a kind of love that didn't shout. It just stayed. Chapter 9. Remembering Without Hurting. The first snowfall came early that year. Martha stood by the window with a cup of cinnamon tea, watching the white flakes dust the fields like powdered sugar on a gingerbread world. Apollo lay on the rug behind her, his tail giving a lazy swish every now and then. He loved the snow. She'd discovered that a few days ago when the first flurries fell. He had bolted outside like a puppy, catching snowflakes with his tongue, spinning in joyful circles, and then flopping down belly first into a drift like a child making snow angels. Martha had laughed, out loud, and it hadn't felt strange. That afternoon, she sat at her kitchen table with a small wooden box she hadn't opened in nearly 2 years. James's things. Inside were folded letters, old Polaroids, a pocket knife he used to carry, and a flannel handkerchief that still smelled faintly of cedar and aftershave. Her fingers trembled slightly as she picked up one photo. James in his overalls, grinning wide beside a newborn calf. She didn't cry. She smiled, and then she talked, out loud, to Apollo. "That's Daisy," she said, holding up the photo. "She was born on a Tuesday. James spent the whole night in the barn with her mother. Wouldn't come inside even for dinner. Called her his lucky charm." Apollo padded over and rested his head on her knee, eyes tilted upward as if he understood the weight of the memory. "I used to think talking about him would break me," she whispered. "But now it feels like remembering keeps him close." Later, at the Everton farm, the regulars gathered with scarves and mittens, their breath visible in the cold air. Someone brought hot cocoa in a thermos. Another passed around ginger snaps wrapped in wax paper. Martha shared the photo of James and Daisy with Helen and Rosa. "He looks like he belonged in a storybook," Rosa said with a grin. "He was my favorite chapter," Martha replied softly. No one cried. No one turned away. They simply listened, nodded, and remembered their own favorite chapters too. It had become a kind of quiet understanding among them all that the past was not a wound to hide, but a garden to tend. Some things bloomed again when shared. That evening, as she and Apollo walked back to the truck, Martha looked up at the stars. "You know," she said, "I thought the pain meant I loved him enough. Like letting it go would be a betrayal." Apollo didn't look at her. He didn't have to. "But love doesn't disappear when the grief fades," she continued. "It just changes shape." Apollo bumped her hand gently with his nose. She bent down, touched her forehead to his. "I think James would have loved you," she whispered. And somehow, in that quiet moment, under a wide December sky, she felt something in her heart shift again. Not a breaking, not a bursting, a settling, a peaceful kind of fullness. Chapter 10. The Full Circle. Christmas came quietly. No bright lights or loud carols, just soft snowfall, warm cider, and a wreath made of cedar and pine cones hung on the old farmhouse door. Martha didn't put up the big tree that year. She didn't need to. Instead, she placed a small tabletop one near the fireplace and decorated it with simple wooden ornaments, some old, some new, and one in the shape of a golden retriever, carved by hand at a local craft fair. It looked just like Apollo, right down to the tilted ears and gentle eyes. When she placed it on the top branch, Apollo wagged his tail once and then curled back up on the rug, as if he approved. On Christmas morning, Martha rose early. She wrapped a scarf around her neck, poured 2 mugs of cocoa, one for herself and one out of habit for James. She set his down on the porch railing like she always had, a quiet ritual, a hello across time. Then she sat beside Apollo on the porch swing and watched the dawn break through the trees. "I used to think life ended when James died," she said. "But it didn't. It just changed." Apollo laid his head gently in her lap, warm and steady. She smiled and ran her fingers through his fur. "You reminded me what love feels like. Not loud, not dramatic, just always there." A few days later, she sat down at her old writing desk, the one James had built from walnut wood, and pulled out a blank card. She began writing a letter. "To the people who rescued Apollo, I wanted to say thank you. Not just for saving his life, but for saving mine. He's been my quiet companion, my reason to get out of bed, my comfort on the loneliest days. But more than that, he reminded me how to love the world again. He's helped me start a little walking group, brought new friends into my life, and somehow made grief a little easier to carry. He doesn't bark much, doesn't ask for anything, just stays. And in doing so, he's healed more than you'll ever know. I think he was always meant to find me. Thank you for giving him that chance. Warmly, Martha Ellen Taylor." She folded the letter gently and slipped it into an envelope. On New Year's Eve, a small group gathered at the Everton farm one last time before winter fully set in. They built a small bonfire and passed around cups of warm spiced cider. Laughter floated through the chilly air like birdsong. Apollo lay in the center of the group, surrounded by boots, mittens, and stories. Martha looked around, at Harold smiling beside Rosa, at Helen tying a scarf around her dog's neck, at Katie with her little girl sitting on her hip. So many lives, once touched by loss, now touched by each other. And it had all started with one golden retriever and a fence full of cows. That night, back at home, Martha and Apollo sat on the porch once more. She looked up at the stars. "Funny," she whispered. "I thought I was rescuing you." Apollo leaned into her side and let out a long, contented breath. And beneath the quiet hush of the trees, under a winter sky dusted with hope, Martha finally understood what James might have said if he were still here. Love doesn't leave. It just changes shape. And sometimes it has 4 legs, golden fur, and the kindest eyes in the world. Sometimes the smallest moments heal the biggest wounds. Sometimes healing doesn't come in the form of grand gestures or loud words. Sometimes it comes quietly, on 4 paws, with a wagging tail, and a heart full of unspoken love. Apollo didn't just rescue Martha from loneliness. He reminded her, and all of us, that joy can return when we least expect it, and that even in the quietest moments, love is still listening. If this story warmed your heart, we'd be honored to have you with us again. Please tap the subscribe button and click the bell so you don't miss our next heartwarming story. Leave us a comment below, even just a heart, to let us know you are here. And if you know someone who could use a little light today, share this video with them, because sometimes the smallest moments heal the biggest wounds. And stories like Apollo's, they're meant to be shared.